Hi everyone, my name is Daria Hodge. I'm one of the LIS PhD students here at FIMS, and I'm also a digitization assistant in archives and special collections at Western Libraries. Today I'm going to talk about how digital humanities are used in the writing and teaching of history at the post-secondary level, and I'm going to talk about how academic librarians can support this work by providing access to digital humanities projects. Throughout this presentation, I will be frequently referencing one digital humanities project that I've used in the past for historical research that I'm quite fond of, the Nickels and Dimes database from Northern Illinois University. This database is an online full-text resource that contains thousands of digitized dime novels from the late 19th and early 20th century, such as this one from 1907, featuring private detective Nick Carter's close call with Adiah, the woman of mystery in her flying machine. So for those not familiar with dime novels, these were cheap publications costing a nickel or a dime. It is difficult to precisely estimate inflation from the late 19th century, but this would be equivalent to approximately $2 to $5 today. One reason why they were so cheap was that they were printed on low-quality paper, similar to later pulp fiction. A lot of the paper that these books were printed on was acid-treated, which reduced the bleeding of ink during the printing process, but over time proved to shorten the lifespan of books by causing them to become extremely brittle with age. They were also often bound with staples, which also doesn't lend well to durability. Dime novels were usually published serially, with characters such as the aforementioned Nick Carter appearing in each installment, while so-called Wild West stories featuring cowboys, homesteaders, and indigenous people were common plots for dime novels. Stories could be in any genre imaginable, from romance to mystery stories, to this early example of science fiction, which features the steam man of the prairies. To be honest, the quality of the prose of these novels was often terrible. The stories were churned out one after another by writers who were paid for quantity over quality. Some dime novels were written as potboilers by more serious authors who mailed in manuscripts for cash. Upton Sinclair, for instance, was one such author. More often, large publishing companies such as Beadle and Adams or Street and Smith, two of the most famous dime novel publishers, had large offices with rows of authors working on stories all at the same time, similar to a newspaper's bullpen. Inspiration for stories could be generated from what could be gleaned from newspaper articles, encyclopedias, or even plagiarized from earlier dime novels. Although dime novels were aimed at a wide audience, towards the end of the 19th century, there was a moral panic surrounding the possible ill effects of young people reading such books, with fears that reading such low-quality novels instead of the classics would impair their literacy skills, but also that reading stories about outlaws such as Jesse James here would lead young people to copy what they read in the novels. So how do dime novels fit into historical research? If you were to ask the average person what history is, we can imagine that they say something like, it's the study of the past. And using that definition, it is easy to see why dime novels would be relevant to someone researching history that way. But I would argue that's a bit too broad of a definition. First, history, from its inception, has always been about answering a specific research question. This aspect of history can be found in the name itself, which comes from the classical Greek word historia, which translates to inquiry. The author who is retrospectively considered the first historian, Herodotus of Halicarnassus, in the 5th century BC, used this term in his work Historiae, which literally translates to the inquiries. In Historiae, Herodotus attempted to answer the questions of what caused the conflicts between Greeks and Persians, which was a topic of great importance to someone who was living in what is now southwestern Turkey in that time period. Likewise, today, in the academy, historians are typically concerned with investigating topics that are important to society today, perhaps to better understand how racial and class inequities in today's society came about, how ideas of what constitutes normative sexuality or gender emerge in society, or what events led to contemporary conflicts between states today. Which brings us to the second addition I'd like to add about the definition of history, is that historical research concerns itself with change over time. In fact, when someone attempts to put something in historical context, this is exactly what they are trying to achieve. That human society is always in flux, and that despite what some might claim are traditional aspects of our culture or society, in fact have specific roots to them, roots that are often not as deep as they might appear on the surface. For instance, the pageantry of the British royal family, particularly in the form of royal jubilees, celebrating the length of reign of British monarchs. They are intended to promote the narrative that the House of Windsor are the legitimate royal family of the UK with pre-modern traditions. Yet the modern jubilee can be traced only as far back as the reign of Queen Victoria in the 19th century. Various factors, historians allege, led to the creation of such a ceremony, some arguing that it was due to Victoria's atypically long life and the need for a celebration to match it, and others point to the need to justify and legitimize British imperial ambitions in the form of spectacle. This brings us to the third additional aspect of history that I'd like to touch on. Historians see today their work as what you might call conversational research. What this means is that there is no expectation of complete objectivity on the part of the historian. Instead, authors are expected to bring their own perspectives, opinions, and theoretical frameworks to the table when interpreting primary sources and creating narratives surrounding past events. The goal of this is so that when someone reads the conversation in the form of books, articles, and conference presentations, and through synthesizing the different approaches taken, one can have a better idea of what was going on in the past. Now, turning to the study of dime novels. One of the first scholarly works to discuss dime novels in depth was Mechanic Accents, Dime Novels and Working Class Culture in America by Michael Denning, published in 1987. He sought to understand what could be learned from the stories printed in dime novels, and how dime novels fit into a rapidly changing and industrializing working class culture of late 19th century America. One of the key theoretical perspectives that Denning was using to interpret his sources was Theodore Adorno's concept of the culture industry. Adorno, who was a critical theorist, argued that culture, commodified and mass-produced under capitalism in the form of network television, big studio movies, and popular music, are intrinsically linked to the economic system that produced them. Under capitalism, art produced this way was not autonomous, but was imbued with the ideology underpinning capitalist relations of production and private ownership of capital. Essentially, according to Adorno, popular media serves as a means of pacifying the working class by promoting capital's interests. With this in mind, the publishing of dime novels can be easily seen as an early example of the culture industry, but Denning wanted to be more nuanced than dismissing them as mere propaganda. He argued that products of the culture industry, like dime novels, can be understood neither as forms of deception, manipulation, and social control, nor as expressions of genuine people's culture opposing and resisting the dominant culture. Rather, they are best seen as contested terrain, a field of cultural conflict where signs with wide appeal and resonance take on contradictory disguises and spoken in contrary accents. What Denning argues is that dime novels had to appeal to their readership: the factory worker on lunch break, the shop girl at the till, the new category of person known as the adolescent. A story about a morally gray outlaw in the so-called Wild West, like Deadwood Dick, could be seen as a Robin Hood-like figure, someone who bucked an economic system that kept millions of working people impoverished, while robber barons accumulated vast amounts of wealth. Though, as Denning alluded to in his main argument, such narratives should not be taken as face value as 100% authentic expressions of the average working person's political beliefs. For instance, in an editorial in the Working Man's Advocate, a union-owned newspaper based in Chicago, one author stated, "Dime novels are, quote, not doing less in the work of ruin than the rum shop or the house of ill fame." One can take from this is that while dime novel stories may have reflected the frustrations of the working class, at the same time they were largely escapist in nature, than constructive in creating a critical consciousness or a movement to change the system. When Denning was writing Mechanic Accents back in the 1980s, he would have had to go physically to archives or perhaps track down private collectors to read dime novels. But now, thankfully due to the establishment of the Nickels and Dimes Project at Northern Illinois University, people can read thousands of digitized copies of dime novels wherever they happen to be, and not have to deal with the expense or currently the legal repercussions of traveling to the United States right now. The project itself was established in 1916 to digitize NIU's holdings of dime novels, which had been bequeathed to the university by two private collectors, who, over the course of their lives, amassed thousands of these dime novels. Over the past 9 years, librarians at NIU have managed to digitize over 13,000 dime novel volumes. Quite a feat for a project such as this. It's probably because they are, for now, generously funded. The database is organized relationally, with patrons being able to find novels by author, by publisher, by recurring character, and by genre. There are also controlled subject headings, which are attached to each issue that allow patrons to find other dime novels that contain similar themes or are about a particular location. And finally, there are quite a few articles written on the website by NIU librarians which provide introductions to various aspects of dime novel scholarship, such as the basics about how dime novels were printed, who their audiences were, and who wrote them. Each has a bibliography to direct patrons to relevant secondary source materials on each subject as well. So it's imperative for those librarians working in academic settings to provide access to a resource such as this to support teaching in the humanities as well as research. A common assignment that I often did in my early undergrad years as a history major was to find a primary source document and analyze it in the context of themes discussed in class. The introduction of students to databases such as this early on in their undergraduate education makes them aware of what sorts of primary sources are out there when drafting full essays later on. Having the freedom to choose their own primary sources not only makes students more engaged with the learning process, but also gives them the ability to explore what subfield of history they might want to study in the future. So, some of the possible themes other than class that one could explore with this research would be gender, which a student could connect to this story, featuring the wild woman of the plains. The caption reads at the bottom, "She downed the cowboy with a club, and Fred caught the bit to arrest her. 'I'll kill you,' she screamed as she raised the club above her head to brain him." Depictions of women on the frontier leading non-conforming lives by the standard of the day were not infrequent in dime novel literature and have been the subject of past research by historians. Denning, in Mechanic Accidents as well, touched on the romantic narratives that were almost always included in dime novels as at least a subplot to the main story, arguing that the romance presented to the readers, quote, contradictions generated when older notions of manhood and womanhood were thrown into question by the new sexual divisions of labor, brought about by industrialization and a growing middle class. And speaking of romance, is interestingly in a dime novel, this one featuring Captain Volcano from 1881, that we see one of the first depictions of an explicitly gay relationship in American literature. There is also just a ton of dime novels featuring cross-dressing and ones that have homoerotic elements, so there is plenty to discuss in that regard too. And finally, due to so much of the literature taking place on the so-called frontier, one can also study depictions of indigenous people around this time. Most of these are, as expected, not great, but these can still provide context about what white settler America projected onto various indigenous peoples at a time when land dispossession under the Dawes Act was still an ongoing process. In addition to providing sources for assignments, one of the main ways to break into the world of scholarly publishing that profs, in my experience, tended to get upper year undergrads to do is to write an academic book review. And the librarians running the Nickels and Dimes have created a program by which patrons can submit critical reviews of dime novels that are vetted and, when approved, are posted to the Nickels and Dimes website to help contextualize and guide other patrons to the titles available to them. So how might we, as academic librarians, make online digital humanities resources like Nickels and Dimes discoverable to our patrons? The main way in which I have seen this done in the past, having worked at several academic libraries in various paraprofessional roles, is using subject guides and providing a description of each resource and a hyperlink. There are a few issues with this method, however. A key one is that subject guides need to be maintained by a subject librarian, or a librarian responsible for subject guides if the library is using a functional staffing model. This can cause problems when a subject guide is given low priority by those responsible for it. For instance, at a few of my past positions, I was tasked with creating or revamping previously uncared for subject guides, such as this one at Queen's University. which was on the history of science and technology. The old version hadn't been updated in close to 10 years and had tons of broken links on it, and references to the old library catalog, QCAT, which had been replaced years prior by Omni. My supervisor was a bit shocked when I told him that these references to the old catalog were still there, because the department had made a project out of changing them on all their subject guides, but this subject guide was so off the radar that it was missed. So I fixed it. I think it's great now, and it has a lot of good resources on it, but since I'm no longer working there, it's also orphaned again. The other way that we can make digital humanities discoverable is to catalog them. This makes it not only discoverable to patrons at one institution, but potentially at all university libraries using Omni. One other digital humanities project that I remember using in undergrad that is cataloged in Omni is the Perseus Digital Library, which contains dozens of Greek and Latin texts, as well as the infamous Greek word study tool, which is a great way for classic students to cheat on their Greek homework. But cataloging a digital humanities project also requires maintenance on the part of a different subset of librarians as well, to make sure that the internet links do not get broken over time. Additionally, the Perseus library, as we can see at the top, is cataloged as a book, which is not quite accurate. It is also assigned subject headings that are also not quite accurate, only mentioning Greek works, while neglecting the fact that the project also covers dozens of Latin texts, as well as hundreds, perhaps thousands of images of Roman art and architecture. So in conclusion, some future research that I am in the process right now is to see how digital humanities are being cataloged or made available to patrons at Canadian research libraries. So far, after checking out Lista and the H.W. Wilson LIS databases, I haven't come across any articles dealing with that particular topic. Perhaps if I'm invited to give a guest lecture for this course in the future, I'll have something to report on the topic. So anyways, I would like to thank Dr. Mayhew again for inviting me to give this lecture. If anyone has any further questions or would like to chat about anything related to digital humanities and history, you can reach me at daria.hodge@uwo.ca. Below are a few of the sources that I used in writing this presentation, as well as a link to the Nichols and Dimes database. Thanks.